This episode of Wheat Pete's Word is brought to you by Syngenta. Stack the deck in your favor in 2025 with a stacked cereals lineup of crop protection products from Syngenta. With proven technology for exceptional disease control and greater plant resilience, you'll find game-changing solutions for your wheat crop. Visit syngenta.ca for more info.
Good day and welcome to Wheat Pete's Word here on Real Agriculture for Wednesday, March the 5th. On this episode of The Word, Pete's in Costa Rica. Yes, it's break week for Pete, so some cool stuff about that. Then, information overload. Oh gosh, how do we sort through all of that stuff? And at the end, agronomy updates. Lots of things to talk about this week, so let's go! And yes, before I begin, I have to start with just a massive shout out to my big brother Paisley. Today, March the 5th, is a milestone birthday for my brother Paisley. Man, he is the patriarch of the Johnson family since our parents passed away. And I'll tell you, there is no person that I can think of on planet Earth that is kinder, gentler, and more supportive. Such an incredible role model for all of the Johnson family. Hey, big brother, happy birthday, man. You deserve it, and many, many more. We want you around for a long time. All right, before we get to Pete being in Costa Rica, a couple of quick notes. The Dawn data is now available. Go to gocrops.ca. You can find out, look at your hybrids, look at their jib ratings. If you're picking one that has really poor ratings, and there is some there, they have awesome yield potential. That's often the problem. We get really high yielding corn hybrids and they're really susceptible to jib and get high Dawn levels. So have a look there. Just double check, and if you have one of those, just manage it accordingly and know the risks involved. And on the weather front, Nature Nut Nick sending the February data. Man, it wasn't as cold as I thought. It sure felt cold, but I guess that's because we've become used to warmer winters. Nick's data says that February 2025 was 1.5 degrees Celsius colder than the long-term average. Not nearly as cold as the Februarys of 2015 or 2014. And our ice cover across the Great Lakes is just slightly above average. Normally, when we get average ice cover, we get average springs, so we'll just hope for that from that perspective. But by the way, Nick, it felt cold enough to Wheat Pete that, yes, he is in Costa Rica this week. So really cool down here. Mark and Teresa out of Niagara, they're here as well. They just happened to see me. I had never met Mark before, but he stopped me. He said, "Wait, Pete, I know you." He'd recognize me. And wow, ever so cool. If you see me out and about anywhere, when I'm in New York State or I'm in the Maritimes, you recognize me, please stop to say hi. It's just very cool. We had a great chat about wheat. The wheat in Niagara, Mark said, had lots of ice on it. That will be melting now with all this rain, but nonetheless, ice is never good for wheat, but nothing you can do about it. All you can do is just wait and stop and see what happens as spring evolves here. By the way, Megan Moran sending out a nice little audio clip about the winter canola. You'd wonder with a winter like this if the winter canola was going to be okay, but she's pretty hopeful. Here's hoping that she's right and that all of the winter crops come through okay. So in Costa Rica, we actually won this trip from the Ingersoll Rotary in their monthly draw, and thanks so much to them. And what I would say from that standpoint is please support those organizations. They do such good work, whether it's Rotary, it's 4-H, there's so many out there. And if you can't afford to support them financially, I get it, but they're always also looking for volunteers. And And we are a community. There's no question about that. So support that community. And while I'm on community, man, yes, the word community. So that Mark and Teresa stopping to say hi, that is part of the word community. And I feel like I built this group of people in agriculture that is pulling together as a team to make things better in agriculture. And I'm just facilitating, man. You send me messages. I try to answer those messages. I try to look up the science. I can't know everything, that's for sure. But we work together. You send me plot results, and that helps further the knowledge base. This is so cool, and I also think it's so important. So while I'm here in Costa Rica, I'm reading a book by Timothy Caulfield, Dr. Timothy Caulfield from I think, University of Edmonton. Anyway, you've heard of him before. He's a great scientist, and he really focuses in on communication and some of the misinformation things. The book I'm reading is called The Certainty Illusion. And I'm nowhere near through it. You will hear more about it on next week's podcast or a podcast down the road because there's so much incredible information in it. But what I find really interesting is the stress that all of the information you have access to on social media puts on people because there's just too much information. How do you sort through what's right, what's wrong, and get to be certain about what that answer is? And that's why it's the certainty illusion. There is no real certainty, or it's so hard to be sure of that answer because there's so just waves of information out there. And the algorithms, if you think one thing, they just support that, even if it's the wrong answer because of this misinformation. However, here's a quote from the book that I find ever so interesting. The information economy is driven not by profiling the truth, but by the accumulation of attention. And so what that says is that you don't win in this information economy by telling the truth. You win in the information economy by gaining attention. How many likes do you get? How many follows do you get? How many views do you get? And by the way, we're a media company, right? Real Agriculture is a media company. Wheat Pete is doing the word. If nobody listens to the word, we're done, right? The word is done. If nobody watches Real Agriculture videos, they're done. So this is 100% true that you need to gain that attention. You need to have people listen. But it should be about profiling the truth, not just about how many people watch that video. It's a really interesting conundrum, and it really comes down to one of the statements at the beginning of Timothy's book, why should I trust you? And that, you just step back and say, why should anybody trust Wheat Pete? And I hope the answer is because I do my very best to look at the science and get the answer out. And all I can say is that I will do my absolute best to deserve the trust you put in listening to Wheat Pete's word. But philosophically, this is a great thought process for me to go through and just kind of go, wow, yeah, there's all that misinformation out there. There's all sorts of bad science, pseudoscience. How do they use that in marketing? And how do we cut through that and come up with the right answers? In agriculture, it's better than some other fields, but nonetheless, you guys ask great questions, and Wheat Pete needs to try to get to the bottom of the answers. So, having said that, let's get to the agronomy updates, because I think it 100% relates. Emily out of Manitoba saying, okay, Pete, last week you talked about manure and about the microbiology, and if you only apply it once, the microbiology is not there. But I have a producer who's put manure on for multiple years, and last year we thought the manure nitrogen should be available. We didn't put as much fertilizer nitrogen on. We suffered very low yields compared to our neighbors, and when we sampled the soil in the fall, there was very high residual nitrates. So the nitrogen was there, the plant didn't use it. What is going on? So Emily, what I maybe didn't say last week that I should have is that what's really interesting in that New York State work by Corrine Ketterings is that sometimes even though we have repeated manure applications, the microbiology doesn't kick in. And again, this is the concept of taking that soil sample at pre-side dress nitrate time, at that V5 to V8 stage, and sampling it for the microbiology and looking, is the microbiology there this year? Or in fact, for whatever reason, is it not kicking in? So we know when it's just, very infrequent manure applications, the microbiology doesn't tend to be primed. But there's research is also showing that even when the microbiology is there, it doesn't always kick in. We don't understand why, but that's what it sounds like. So Emily, you asked, would that high nitrogen cause a zinc tie-up? Is there a nutrient issue? So on the zinc front, highly unlikely. Zinc and phosphorus are related. Magnesium and potash are related. The magnesium-potash relationship is much weaker than the zinc-phosphorus relationship. When you look at nitrogen, if there was an issue with nitrogen, it would be with sulfur. But if you had a sulfur deficiency, you should have seen that in the crop. And Emily's saying that they're really not seeing any deficiencies in the crop. So what it sounds like to me, just standing back and hypothesizing, is that probably the microbiology did not kick in last year the way that we would hope it would, and that has been the challenge with giving manure nitrogen credits. The work by Don Flayton in Manitoba showing that if you looked at that yearly credit, it just didn't kick in the way you would expect it to, but if you looked at the credit long term, it built up and was much more reliable. Here in Ontario, that giving nitrogen credits to manure, as much as we should be able to do that, hasn't been as consistent. However, having said that, the pre-citrate nitrate test has helped pick that up. Go back a couple of years, and we had soil nitrates at pre-side dress time that were in the 90s. We know that the critical value is 35. We did the test. There was no added nitrogen needed. So I think between the microbiology and the soil nitrate test, we can still pick that up. But just because we've had those repeated applications doesn't mean it becomes available. We don't quite understand why. Katie saying, hey, Peter, you talked about early sulfur on soybeans when you're out in Manitoba here, and I'm just asking, in the Sean Castile work, how did he apply that? Because if I put my sulfur in furrow, wouldn't that be very deleterious to the soybean plant? And Katie, 100%, the soybeans will be dead if you put 20 pounds of actual sulfur, 100 pounds of ammonium sulfate in furrow with soybeans. You will have zero soybean stand. Don't do that. It was a broadcast application. I would think a sideband would be fine as well. I'm not sure how you're seeding your soybeans in Manitoba, but if you're using a drill, you have mid-row banders, or if you can get that sulfur away from the seed, I think those are options, broadcast as well. But the other comment that Katie made was, the research I showed, the one particular data point was 20 bushel yield increase to sulfur on soybeans in Ontario. Okay, whoa, stop. Be careful now. Yes, I showed that data, but I also said that was one very, very sandy site that is clearly highly responsive to sulfur. So when you look at Horse database, I think he's now at a 3.5 bushel per acre yield increase. But if you take the 5 most responsive sites out of the 34 sites that he's got, that is responsible for that average yield gain. Over most of the other sites, the other 29 or whatever number of sites that is, there's almost no gain to sulfur at all, perhaps a bushel. So the sulfur on soybean story is one that we want to investigate. I'm highly excited about it. I think it makes perfect sense because we're getting less sulfur out of the environment. But Wheat Pete is not saying put sulfur on every soybean acre in Ontario, in New York State, in Ohio, in Michigan, in Manitoba. Man, they aren't all going to respond. Sand soils with low organic matter, yes. Early planted soybeans in cold climates, let's do the plots. Let's sort out where we can get that response. Horse data at Elora in 2024, and Elora's a silt loam soil. The beans weren't planted particularly early, kind of average range and good organic matter, a soil type that I would say, man, not going to see sulfur response in that one trial was a 7.5 bushel yield response. So it's something we have to look at, but it's not a guarantee. And so there, I'm trying to do my best to deserve that trust. I'm not trying to overhype sulfur on soybeans. I'm trying to say, man, the data is out there that we need to look and figure it out, because in some situations, it will make you 20 bushels per acre. Late planted soybeans, June planted soybeans in Ontario, don't bother with sulfur. The chances of getting a response, unless you're on a really sandy soil, is about zero. So put it in context. I guess that's the answer. Hey, Jason, finally getting around to sending me some nitrogen source trials on wheat, and really cool. He did some AMS pure yield urea blends versus either AMS and urea or 28 and ATS, and so it looked like there was a slight yield advantage to the AMS pure yield urea blend. Economically, it wasn't a big win, but from a strict yield perspective, and it was a replicated trial, so good on you, Jason. It did look like there was perhaps something there. More research needed for sure, but yes, the other really cool thing that Jason passed along is last fall when he was clipping his clover, and he hadn't noticed it till he went through and was chopping the clover down, where he used the 28%. He had less clover, in some cases a really easily definable line, other places not so much. And I step back and say, yes, Shane and I have seen that in our trials as well. There's two things that come to mind. One, we know that clover is really highly responsive to sulfur applications. We had trials, actually one was at Dr. Dave Hooker's farm, and we were doing sulfur on wheat trials. Dave put red clover down where we put the no sulfur treatments, we got no red clover. Where we applied sulfur with the nitrogen, we had red clover. As soon as I use ammonium thiosulfate, the sulfur doesn't become available quite as quickly because the thiosulfate has to transform to sulfate. It's fairly quickly, but that differential, perhaps that had a clover impact. It just didn't nodulate as quickly. It needed that sulfur early, and because it didn't get there, it had that stress. Or 28% does burn. If you hit it just at the right time, you can burn the clover. Sometimes that's enough to take it out. So a couple of cool things there to think about. But man, you're going to use clover with your wheat, get your sulfur on early and get it there in the sulfate form if you can. I think that will support better clover establishment. All right, while we're on wheat, Glenn Arnold's putting out a nice article in the corn newsletter from Ohio State about top dressing manure onto wheat. And I mean, absolutely, you can do that. Remember that you're going to lose more nitrogen from volatilization, so depending on what the source is, and in Glenn's data and in the data that Shane and I also did, you cannot rely on all of the nitrogen out of manure, particularly if it's dairy manure. There just isn't enough nitrogen there. With finishing hog manure, you probably can get away with it, but you have to look strictly at the ammonium fraction, that immediately available nitrogen. The last thing that Glenn put in the article, I think phenomenally interesting, is that you want to top dress with a drag hose. And what's interesting about the drag hose is that even when you go later in wheat development, right up to Feek 7, which is growth stage 32, second node, that you can pull that drag hose over the wheat and it doesn't seem to break the stem. That seems to just fold it down, bend it down, it stands back up and it handles it fine. Now, at growth stage 32, it's pretty late for the nitrogen application. I hope you put some nitrogen on earlier than that. But the fact that wheat will tolerate it at bigger growth stages than we would expect is kind of interesting. Matt from New York State saying, okay, Peter, we're dairy farmers. We've got lots of dairy farmers. They're growing wheat. How much nitrogen, how much sulfur? They're not going to be intensive growers because they're growing wheat to make money and also for the straw. They need the straw, but they make their money in the barn. And so what's a good program for a dairy farmer in New York State to grow an excellent wheat crop without trying to get the very last bushels, without trying to be a top wheat grower. So the simple answer is there's probably manure in the rotation. Matt, 90 pounds of nitrogen, 15 pounds of sulfur, and a T3 fungicide. And the 90 pounds of nitrogen may well be too little, but you would have to play with that and do the trials, maybe up to 120 pounds of nitrogen, but that's the range that you're looking at. It's kind of a base program. Without manure, it's 120 pounds of nitrogen. With manure, maybe 90 is enough, or 100, something like that. But dairy manure, man, she's pretty hard to predict when that stuff becomes available, applied last fall, that is. The other question Matt asked me that I think is really interesting, he asked, is 60 pounds of nitrogen on rye enough for a forage crop? So they grow corn silage, they plant rye, they're taking that for a forage crop, and then they're planting whatever after that, either corn silage again, hopefully not. We talked about that last week. That's tough, but probably soybeans. And the answer is no. Matt, 60 pounds of nitrogen, you will have all sorts of allelopathy in the rye. You will have low protein in that rye. If you're harvesting that for a dairy forage, you need a lot more nitrogen. And at a minimum, I think, is double your nitrogen, 120 pounds. When you look at Tom Kilser's work, they're actually up to 200 pounds of nitrogen and sometimes more. I have neighbors that are dairy farmers that are up to 220 pounds of nitrogen on their triticale to try to get both yield and also protein. It takes a lot of nitrogen to make protein in that forage crop. And don't forget the sulfur. You need quite a bit of sulfur there as well. So that's a watch out from that standpoint. And with that, I have talked long enough. That's it. That's all on behalf of the team here at Real Agriculture. This is Wheat Pete with the word from Costa Rica this week for Wednesday, March the 5th. Hey, please keep the messages coming. Keep the feedback coming. Keep saying hi when you see me out in the countryside, man. It's awesome. I love it, and I greatly appreciate it. We will talk to you next week.